On the morning of May 14, 1852, the front pages in New Orleans all carried the same astonishing line. A young man of 23 had just sold for a price that shattered every record in the South. The papers called him exceptional, remarkable, even beautiful. What they did not print was the quiet rumor that ran beneath the headlines like an underground river, that the young man on the marble block at the 18th Hotel never should have been there at all. To understand how he reached that platform, the story must begin upriver, at a place that no map bothers to name anymore. Riviere-Redocan Plantation lay 43 miles above New Orleans, a world built on sugar and silence. The main house rose from the earth like a whitewashed palace. 3 stories of brick wrapped in galleries, their iron railings imported from France when Louisiana still spoke French to itself. A tunnel of live oaks shaded the carriage road, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that turned daylight into green dusk. Visitors stepped out of their carriages and felt either enchanted or suffocated. Riviere-Redocan was that kind of place. The DeVoe family had ruled it since 1791. They were Creole aristocracy, French-speaking Catholics who traced their blood back to Normandy and their pride even further. They did not think of themselves as Americans. They tolerated American money, American laws, American ambition. But in their own minds, they were something older and finer. In 1852, the master of Riviere-Redocan was Monsieur Anatole DeVoe, 56, a widower and a man who believed order could be written into the world with ink, numbers and rules. His ledgers were impeccable, neat columns, careful handwriting, no smudges, no chaos. His reputation matched his books, honorable in business, cautious with debt, punctual at mass, and, as he liked to say, appropriately Christian, to the people he owned. He had 3 daughters, all married into the right families, pews reserved in the right churches, a place in the right clubs. His world worked because every person in it stayed where they were placed. There had been, once, someone who refused placement. Anatole's younger brother, Christophe, had been everything Anatole was not: charming, talented, irresponsible. While Anatole learned sugar yields and crop rotations, Christophe learned piano and poetry. When their father died in 1821, he left Riviere-Redocan entirely to Anatole. Christophe received an allowance and a condition. He was to have no voice in the plantation's affairs. Christophe took the money and crossed the ocean. From Paris, cheerful letters arrived for years, filled with descriptions of cafes, theaters, smoky salons where people argued about ideas instead of land. Anatole paid his brother's debts and turned his eyes back to sugar and storms and the Mississippi. Then in 1827, a different kind of letter came. Inside was a small daguerreotype, a young woman, perhaps 20, seated stiffly in Parisian fashion. Her dress was modest but elegant, her posture precise, her eyes dark and luminous. On the back, in Christophe's looping French, a single line: "Ca lest Moreau DeVoe, my wife. Your sister-in-law. You would love her, mon frère." The photograph said what the letter did not. Ca lest's skin was just a shade too warm, her features just a little too telling. In Paris, she might be mistaken for Italian or Spanish. In Louisiana, Anatole needed no imagination at all to see the truth. Ca lest had African blood. In the world Anatole had built, that single fact was an earthquake. His reply was short and absolute. Christophe's marriage would not be recognized. Any children would not be recognized. Christophe was welcome to his love, his life, his Paris, but not to Riviere-Redocan. The allowance would continue. The family tie, as far as Louisiana society was concerned, ended there. 4 months later, another letter arrived, slower, softer in tone. Christophe accepted the sentence with a kind of resigned grace. At the end, he added one line: "My son was born last month. His name is John Baptiste. He will never know he had an uncle in Louisiana." For more than 20 years, Christophe kept his word. No more appeals, no more photographs, only the mechanical confirmation from a Parisian bank that the allowance was still being drawn. Anatole's life settled into its grooves: marriage, daughters, the death of his wife in 1844, rising profits, rising standing. To most of Louisiana, he was simply Monsieur DeVoe of Riviere-Redocan, a man with no brother at all. Then, in March of 1852, a letter arrived that forced the past back into the room. It had traveled a long way, forwarded from New York, its edges softened by too many hands. The handwriting was Christopher's, but tremulous now, letters fraying at their ends as if the ink itself were tired. The message was not long. Tuberculosis, 6 months of decline, little time left, and one final request. My son, Jean-Baptiste, is 23, educated at the Sorbonne. He speaks 4 languages. He has never done manual labor, and I confess would be hopeless at it. His mother died in 1848. I am leaving him nothing but books and the memory of a father who failed to prepare for the end. He will have no family in Paris, no connections, no money. I am asking you not to embrace him as kin. I understand that is impossible for you, but to take him in as something useful. A secretary, perhaps. You have always needed a clever hand for your correspondence. He will earn his keep. He is the only good thing I have ever done. Anatole read the letter 3 times, standing in his study beneath the staring eyes of devout ancestors whose painted faces had never known such complications. Inside him, 2 forces wrestled. One was pride Creole, rigid, terrified of scandal. The other was habit, the old habit of using every opportunity to strengthen his position. A nephew in Paris had been dangerous. A half-hidden young man in Louisiana might be useful. He sat at his desk, dipped his pen, and wrote a calm, measured reply. Jean-Baptiste was to come to Rivière-Ridocan. Passage to New Orleans, then by steamboat upriver. Anatole would receive him and determine appropriate arrangements. He folded the letter, sealed it, and sent it north. Then he sat alone with the fading light spilling across his ledgers and let a colder idea harden inside him. There was a problem coming downriver. Problems, properly handled, could become assets. On April 3, 1852, the steamboat's whistle announced its arrival at the plantation's private landing. Anatole waited on the dock with his overseer Gaines and 3 trusted house servants. The river wind smelled of mud and sugar and distant rain. When the gangplank dropped, every head on the dock turned. The young man who stepped onto Louisiana soil did not look like a problem. He looked like something carved. He was tall, over 6 feet, slim but not frail. His dark hair fell in a Parisian wave, too long for American fashion, but perfectly suited to the oval of his face. His eyes were an unsettling amber, green, clear even at a distance. High cheekbones, straight nose, a mouth that looked more suited to reciting poetry than begging favor. His skin was very light, not the flushed pink of the Americans who sweated their way through summers, but a smooth, pale tone that might pass in New Orleans salons without a second glance. Whatever his mother had been, the boy did not wear her story on his face. He could have walked into any white parlor in Louisiana and been taken for an aristocrat. He carried a single leather trunk, expensive once, now carefully mended. His suit was finely cut but worn at the seams, his boots polished to a shine that could not hide the scuffs in the leather. Everything about him said the same thing: good breeding, thinning resources. He saw Anatole and stopped at the foot of the gangplank. For a heartbeat, uncle and nephew simply stared at one another. Anatole seeing a ghost of Christopher at 23, Jean-Baptiste seeing the man who had exiled his father before he was born. Then the young man set down his trunk and spoke first, in flawless French. "Monsieur Deveau," he said quietly, "I am Jean-Baptiste. Thank you for receiving me. I know this cannot be easy for you. It is not easy for me either." His tone was respectful, but it carried none of the fear Anatole was used to hearing from those who depended on him. He spoke as someone who had never been trained to bow. Anatole did not take his hand. He studied the boy instead, cataloging details the way he cataloged tonnage and interest rates. The grace in the way he stood, the lack of visible African ancestry, the unmistakable resemblance to Christopher. Valuable, Anatole thought, and dangerous. "Follow me," he said. He walked away without checking to see if Jean-Baptiste obeyed. Gaines hefted the trunk. The 3 house servants, light-skinned Creoles who knew better than to comment, watched the young man pass. Later, Marie-Claire, one of the maids, would tell the others that he walked like a condemned man who understood the sentence, but refused to beg. They did not go to the main house. Anatole led him instead to a small cabin tucked behind it. One room, a narrow bed, a table, a single chair, a washstand, a little fireplace cold in the spring heat. Not a hovel, but not a guest chamber either. The sort of place reserved for servants too important to be sent to the quarters, yet never allowed under the family roof. "This will be your lodging," Anatole said. "Food and water will be brought. We will discuss your duties in the morning. Until then, you do not leave this cabin. You do not speak to anyone. Do you understand?" Jean-Baptiste looked around the room. For a breath, something almost amused passed over his face, as if the gap between Paris and this cabin were so immense it had become unreal. "I understand," he answered. "May I ask a question?" "No." Anatole closed the door behind him. The lock did not click yet, but the message was clear. Later that evening, Marie-Claire brought a tray rice beans, a scrap of chicken, bread still warm from the kitchen. She knocked softly. When he opened the door, she kept her eyes down and held out the tray the way she would to any new servant. "Thank you," he said, in her own French, not the rough plantation version but the Parisian kind. She glanced up, surprised. "You're his nephew," she whispered. "My father's brother," he said. She hesitated, then asked the question that mattered. "Does he know about your mother?" A thin, humorless smile touched his mouth. "Oh yes, he knows." Marie-Claire studied him a heartbeat longer, taking in the clothes, the bearing, the fine bones of his face, and the tiny, invisible line he was already walking. "Be careful," she murmured. "Monsieur Deveau is not a cruel man. But he is a man who loves what makes sense on paper. Men like that can do terrible things and never feel wicked, because the numbers add up." She left before he could answer. Jean-Baptiste ate mechanically, too tired to taste. Then he unpacked his trunk on the little table, 2 spare shirts, worn but clean, a carefully folded black coat, a few books, their leather cracked at the corners, a French Bible, a packet of letters tied with string, his father's voice on thin paper. Last, he laid out a leather portfolio. Inside were the pieces of his life that truly mattered, his Parisian birth certificate, naming his parents as Christophe Deveau and C.A. Les Moreau, his baptismal record, certificates from his studies, glowing letters from Sorbonne professors, ink and seals and signatures, proof that he was free, that his mind was trained, that he belonged to a world far away from cane fields and overseers. He stared at them for a long time. Then, with a quiet, careful motion, he took a blank sheet and began to write a detailed inventory of every document, dates, offices, official wording. He wrote in precise, tiny script and folded the pages into the spine of his copy of Montaigne, where no casual hand would find them. His father had once told him, "In this world, the right paper stands between you and disaster. Guard your papers like your soul." In the dark cabin behind Rivière Aucun's shining house, the young man who had been raised as a free French citizen lay down fully dressed on the narrow bed. He listened to the foreign chorus of a Louisiana night, the shrill of insects, the thin thread of song drifting from the distant quarters, and, beneath everything, the slow, invisible breathing of the Mississippi. He did not yet know that by morning, the first thing his uncle would ask for were those papers, and that handing them over would be the first step toward the marble block in New Orleans. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the world Jean-Baptiste knew ended behind a polished cypress desk. Anatole's study was the opposite of the little cabin. High ceilings, tall windows, shelves lined not with novels but with ledgers, their leather spines darkened by years of handling. The portraits of Deveau men watched from the walls, each one a reminder that this room was where reality was decided and written down. Jean-Baptiste stood while his uncle sat. It was a small thing, but it made the balance of power unmistakable. "You have your papers?" Anatole asked in French. "Yes, monsieur." "Bring them to me. For your protection. There are many fraudulent documents in circulation. I would not wish you to be mistaken for an impostor." There was nothing in his tone you could grab onto as cruelty. It was smooth, almost courteous. That was what made it dangerous. Jean-Baptiste returned to the cabin and came back with the leather portfolio, fingers tight around it. It made a soft, final sound, like a door closing. Anatole opened it and began to read. Birth certificate, Paris, 1829. Baptism at Saint Sulpice, certificates from Lycée Louis le Grand. Letters from Sorbonne professors praising the clarity of his reasoning and his exemplary character. Every document bore the right ink, the right seals, the right signatures. Each one said the same thing: this man is free, this man is educated, this man is someone. For 20 minutes, Anatole examined them with a practiced eye, occasionally making neat notes in a small notebook. Jean-Baptiste watched his own life turned into a set of details, dates, places, references, all reduced to a quiet scratching of pen on paper. At last, Anatole closed the portfolio, placed it inside his desk drawer, and turned the key. "I will keep these here," he said, "for safekeeping." Something inside Jean-Baptiste compacted, as if the air around him had grown heavy. He had expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt as if his lungs were learning to breathe different air. "Now," Anatole went on, "we must discuss your situation." He leaned back, steepling his fingers the picture of reason. "You are my brother's son. I gave him my word I would receive you. But you must understand what your presence means in Louisiana." He spoke slowly, as if explaining arithmetic to a child. "Your mother was colored. Under our law, that makes you colored. It does not matter that you were born in Paris. It does not matter where you studied. Blood defines you here, not geography." He let that hang in the air, watching the impact. "If I acknowledge you as my nephew, as family, it invites questions, scandal. My daughters are married into important houses. My name is tied to banks, to parishes, to men who do not wish to be surprised. One rumor about a colored nephew, and everything I have built begins to shake. I will not allow that." Jean-Baptiste's hands were clasped behind his back, fingers pressed so tightly together the knuckles blanched. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but it had turned thin at the edges. "So why did you ask me to come, monsieur?" "Because I am not without compassion," Anatole said, "and because I am practical. I can give you shelter, food, and work. You will serve as my secretary. You will handle my correspondence, particularly in French. You will keep certain ledgers. You will live in the cabin. In return, you will not speak of Paris. You will not mention your father. You will not show your papers to anyone. As far as this parish is concerned, you will simply be Jean-Baptiste, a light-skinned slave acquired by private sale." The word landed between them like a dropped stone. "Slave," Jean-Baptiste repeated. "You are asking me to pretend to be enslaved. I am asking you to survive." Anatole corrected. "Without my name behind you, your position here is precarious. Your French documents mean little to American officials. A man who looks like you, speaks with an accent, and cannot prove his mother's status can be detained, questioned, claimed. There are many who would be less scrupulous than I am. Under my protection, the fiction of your enslavement keeps you safe." He said it so reasonably that for a moment, it almost sounded like generosity. "And if I refuse?" Jean-Baptiste asked. Anatole did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply laid out the facts. "Then I will return your papers, place a modest sum in your hand, and you may go to New Orleans alone. You speak little English. You have no relatives here, no contacts, no employment, no understanding of our laws. Perhaps you will succeed. Perhaps you will be arrested as a vagrant. Perhaps someone will decide your papers are false and take you as their property. I am not your jailer, Jean-Baptiste. The country is." The room seemed to narrow around the young man. In Paris, freedom had been the baseline, something so natural it was never named. Here, it was a fragile, negotiable thing handed out or taken back by men who held keys. He thought of his father, coughing in a narrow bed in some New York boarding house, writing that final letter with shaking hands because he had no one else left to ask. He thought of C.A. Lest, who had crossed an invisible line somewhere in her life, from free woman to dangerous bloodline, and carried that mark into his birth. Anatole watched him weigh the choices, watched the numbers line up behind his eyes. I understand, John Baptist said at last, the words tasting metallic in his mouth. Good, Anatole replied. Then we will regularize matters. He pulled one of his ledgers closer, opened to a fresh page, dipped his pen and began to speak as he wrote. Acquired April 3rd, 1852. One male, age 23, named Jean Baptiste, no surname. Light-skinned, educated, suitable for domestic and clerical work. Source private sale. No bill of sale available. Estimated value, $2,000. He did not look up until the ink dried. There, he said. Now you exist in my records. Your presence here is explained to anyone who asks. Your papers are secure. You have a place, a function, and my protection. It is, under the circumstances, the best arrangement either of us can hope for. Jean Baptiste stared at the line, where his name was pinned to a price. It had taken his uncle less than a minute to do what no one in Paris had ever imagined possible, reduce him to a figure in a book. May I ask one more question? Monsieur, he said, and this time the formality sounded like a blade. Of course. When you read my father's letter, Jean Baptiste asked quietly, did you ever intend to help me as a nephew? Or was this what you meant from the very beginning? For a fleeting instant, something flickered in Anatole's face. An echo of the young man who had once watched his brother board a ship, perhaps. Regret or annoyance at being seen too clearly. Then it was gone. I intended to do what was practical, he said. For both of us. He closed the ledger. The matter to him was settled. Come, he said. Let me show you where you will work. For the next 5 weeks, Riviere-Docan accepted the fiction as if it had always been fact. In the mornings, Jean Baptiste sat at a smaller desk in a side room off the study, copying letters in his elegant hand, translating contracts from French to English and back again, correcting arithmetic no one else in the house could see. He absorbed the plantation's business as quickly as any soil absorbed rain. Shipping schedules, loan renewals, prices in Havre and Bordeaux, discreet notes about which merchants drank too much and which judges could be relied upon. In the afternoons, Anatole called him in to discuss terms. The older man found himself asking questions he had never imagined he would put to someone he legally owned. What do you make of this clause about penalties for late delivery? How vulnerable is this bank to European shocks? Is this French partner as reliable as he claims in his letter? Jean Baptiste answered with care, always framing his observations as suggestions, never as corrections, but his insight was sharp. Twice, Anatole altered deals based on his advice, and later saw his caution rewarded when another planter lost money on the very terms Jean had warned against. It grated and pleased Anatole at once. The boy was an asset, far more valuable at that desk than in any field, but he was also a constant reminder that the Devoe blood could produce intelligence outside its narrow, lawful channels. The other enslaved people watched this strange arrangement from the edges of rooms and doorways. To the field hands, he was a roommate, a pale man in plain clothes who slept in a cabin, yet spent his days with books. Among the house servants, he was a puzzle. He worked like them, but did not move like them. He spoke French like a gentleman, but used monsieur and madame for Anatole's married daughters with an ease that should not have belonged to someone recorded as property. He shared their food, but not their history. Some kept their distance, suspicious of anyone who could be both slave and not slave in the same breath. Others, Marie-Claire Thomas in the stables, old Yvette in the kitchen, extended small gestures that felt, to him, like lifelines. An extra spoon of sugar in his coffee, a quiet warning when Anatole was in a mood, a whispered explanation of which rules mattered and which only existed to be broken carefully. At night, alone in his cabin, he opened the Montaigne that now hid his inventory and the letter he had begun to write in his head and on paper. A letter that, if ever sent, would be more dangerous than any weapon he could hold. He did not sleep well. Dreams chased him backwards, his father's apartment in Paris, the cold stone of the Sorbonne courtyard, the smell of ink and fresh bread. He would wake with the taste of French rain in his mouth and the sound of Louisiana insects shrilling in his ears. unsure for a moment which country he belonged to. By the end of April, the fiction had settled over the plantation like a thin, invisible film. No one spoke about what he had been before. On paper, he was a slave. In memory, he was Christopher's son. In his own mind, he stood in a place where none of the old words fit. Anatole made a mistake then, not with a pen, but with pride. In early May, he needed to go to New Orleans to negotiate shipping rates and secure advances for the coming harvest. The journey was routine. He had made it dozens of times. This time, though, he decided to bring his new secretary. It was a calculated piece of theater. A man who conducted business in French and English with equal ease, who could read complicated contracts and correct them on the spot, who could draft letters to Parisian banks in a hand that would not embarrass a Parisian clerk. That was a useful thing to display. It made Anatole look modern, cosmopolitan, more at home in the transatlantic world than the rough American planters upriver. They traveled by steamboat, arriving in the city on a Wednesday morning. The levee teemed with life cotton bales, shouting dockhands, women balancing baskets, children running where they shouldn't, sailors cursing in 3 languages. The wet smell of the river mixed with the sharper tang of coffee and horse sweat, and too many people packed too close. In drawing rooms and counting houses, Jean-Baptiste stood slightly behind his uncle, notebook in hand, his head bowed just enough to be proper. He took notes when told, translated when asked, and tried to be invisible. It did not work. Everywhere they went, eyes followed him. At a merchant's house on Chartres Street, conversations thinned when he entered. At a bank off Royal, a young clerk nearly forgot to fetch the correct ledger because his gaze kept flicking back to Jean. Women in pale dresses found excuses to pass near the corner where he stood, slowing slightly, their fans stilled for once. He felt the attention like heat on his skin. He did not invite it. He did not encourage it. It came anyway. During a meeting at the home of Philip Laurier, a commission merchant whose fortune swelled and shrank with the river, Laurier's wife watched Jean long enough that even the careful hostess in her finally surrendered to curiosity. During a pause in the negotiations, she glided over to Anatole, all smiles and soft voice. "Monsieur Devoe," she said in French, "forgive my boldness, but I must ask, that young man who attends you, is he yours?" The question was perfectly ordinary on its face. In New Orleans, one could ask about human beings the way one would ask about a fine horse. Anatole's answer was smooth. "A recent acquisition," he said. "He serves as my secretary." Madame Laurier looked openly then, with the direct appraisal reserved for something on display. "I have never seen a slave like him," she said. "He is remarkable. Where did you find such a one?" "A private transaction," Anatole replied lightly. "From an estate near Baton Rouge." "Would you consider offers?" Another voice cut in, a widow named Madame Helny Fourier, owner of a fashionable boarding house and a staff of carefully selected light-skinned servants. Her gaze did not waver. "I would pay extremely well for someone of that appearance and education." Anatole demurred, deflecting with talk of usefulness and attachment. But the words "pay extremely well" stayed with him all the way back up the river. That night in his study at Rivière-d'Aucun, while the house slept and the insects sang outside the shuttered windows, he opened a fresh page in a different ledger and began to do a new kind of arithmetic. He had written Jean's value as $2,000, a high figure already. After what he had seen in the city, that number felt almost timid. The way women stared, the way men calculated, the way the room changed when the boy entered. There was a market for such beauty, at least among certain houses. A kind of fever took hold when that kind of rarity appeared. 3,000, perhaps. More. He tapped the feathered tip of the pen against the page, feeling something uncoil inside him, a greedy, cold little thought that whispered of possibilities. Jean-Baptiste, here on the plantation, was an asset and a complication. He attracted notice. He did work others could not do, but he also existed as a constant risk. If anyone ever looked too closely at his face, and then at Anatole's, If anyone ever remembered Christophe, if any scrap of old Paris gossip made its way across the ocean, questions would bloom like mold. A public sale, on the other hand, would solve everything. If he sold the boy at the St. Louis Hotel, the grandest auction block in New Orleans, under the high dome where the city's elite came to display their power, it would do more than bring money. It would fix Jean-Baptiste's story in the most unassailable ink the South possessed, the record of a legal sale. Once the auctioneer wrote the entry and the bids were taken, once money changed hands under the eyes of the city, Jean-Baptiste's past would matter less than the parchment recording his purchase. He would simply be what the bill of sale said he was: property. Better for him, Anatole told himself as the numbers climbed in his mind. A grand house in the city, domestic work instead of the fields, perhaps music books. Better than uncertainty. He did not write those thoughts down. He did not need to. The decision had already taken root. On May 8th, Anatole began inquiries at the St. Louis Hotel. 4 days later, in the small cabin behind the big house, the knock on Jean-Baptiste's door sounded different. Too firm, too final. When he opened it, Anatole stood there with Gaines and one of the house servants behind him. 3 men where one usually came. That was how Jean-Baptiste knew, before a word was spoken, that his uncle had found another line in another ledger, and that this time the number next to his name would not be an estimate, but a price shouted aloud under the echoing dome of New Orleans. On the morning of May 13th, 1852, Jean-Baptiste understood the difference between being trapped and being claimed. Trapped was Rivière-Docan, a cabin with a locking door, a job that used his mind but not his will, a life dressed politely in lies. Claimed was the rope now tied around his wrists. Gaines, the overseer, had bound him with the same practiced efficiency he used on field hands who were being moved or punished. Loops tight, not centered, no slack, not enough to injure, just enough to remove choice from the body, necessary precaution. Anatole said, as if he were discussing weather, "You disappear in the city, and what am I to tell buyers? That my property ran away before they could examine him. Property. Buyers." The words floated around Jean-Baptiste like smoke as he was led toward the carriage. He did not speak. He did not resist. Resistance, he already understood, would not change the ending, only its brutality. He had spent 5 weeks learning Louisiana. He knew the law now. He knew the city. He knew how fast a man without papers could vanish into someone else's ledger. If he ran, if he even tried, he would not remain free long enough for anyone to learn his name. So he stepped into the carriage and let them take him. The road to New Orleans, the river road, was quiet, flanked by canes sprouting pale green in the spring heat. Here and there, a pair of slaves in the fields paused to watch the carriage pass. The moment their eyes met Jean-Baptiste's, they looked away, not because they did not care, but because they understood too much. Light skin did not protect anyone from bondage. Education did not protect anyone. A French accent did not protect anyone. In Louisiana, only papers protected a man, and his papers were locked in his uncle's desk. At noon, the carriage stopped at the private landing, where a steamboat waited with its paddles thrumming the muddy water. The deckhands tied the ropes. The bell clanged, and Jean-Baptiste was taken aboard. Gaines tied him to a railing with a length of hemp rope, not to hurt him but to claim him. A visible, undeniable marker. This man belongs to someone. Rain clouds thickened over the river. The air tasted like metal. Baptiste stood still, back straight, jaw set. He stared out at the wide brown water and refused to let anyone see fear on his face. Pride was the only possession he had left. He held it like a blade. The trip took 5 hours. In that time, passengers drifted past him the way people drift past a strange animal at a market, staring too long, whispering behind hands, trying to guess his story. A merchant's wife paused nearby and murmured to her companions, "Her looks extraordinary." What a waste. Waste, extraordinary, both true, both humiliating. But the worst was when a man on the upper deck, a wealthy planter by his clothes, leaned over the railing and said, "Devou's bringing him to the hotel, I hear. Looks like he'll fetch 6,000. Jean-Baptiste's stomach tightened. $6,000. He had grown up measuring value in francs and ideas and character. In Louisiana, the scale was different. Here, a man could be weighed in dollars the way beef or sugar was. 6,000 meant rarity. 6,000 meant spectacle. 6,000 meant danger. A man worth that much money did not leave the auction block unnoticed. The city that consumed men, New Orleans, rose from the river in layers. Wharves, warehouses, wrought iron balconies dripping with vines, carriages clattering on cobblestone. Sounds collided in the air: Creole, French, American English, Spanish, laughter. Bargaining, newspapers hawked by barefoot boys. The city smelled of coffee, horses' sweat, and the river's rot. Under normal circumstances, Jean-Baptiste would have loved it. Under these circumstances, it felt like jaws closing. Gaines untied him from the railing, but kept the rope on his wrists, guiding him through the crowd with a firm hand between the shoulders. People parted instinctively, some because of the rope, some because of the sharp, unnatural beauty of the man being led. Several women stopped to stare outright. One man muttered, awed above. Another breathed. Deveu's got himself a miracle, a commodity, a spectacle. Not a person, not anymore. The St. Louis Hotel at the corner of St. Louis and Royal Street rose a building that looked more like a palace than a hotel. White plastered walls, tall arches, balconies trimmed with cast iron. The courtyard echoed with footsteps and voices. At its center was the rotunda, a circular hall topped with a soaring dome of glass that poured sunlight onto everything below. Slaves were bought and sold here the way diamonds were sold in Europe, with ceremony, performance, and ruthless calculation. Inside the rotunda, the floor glimmered like polished bone. A crowd already waited: merchants, widows, bankers, brokers in tailored coats. The auctioneer, Monsieur Rigault, stood under the dome with a ledger the size of a Bible. Gaines led Jean-Baptiste forward. The room rippled. Whispers spread like heat. Is that him? The DeVoe boy? No, DeVoe's nephew died. Is not family. DeVoe purchased him near Baton Rouge. Look at his face. He'll go for a record price. A record. He was not a man. He was an event. Rigault saw him and strode forward, expression sharpening as if someone had placed a jewel in his hands. DeVoe, he said, you have brought something remarkable indeed. Anatole spoke softly, privately, with the careful tone of a man who holds a secret that will soon become profit. No mention of Paris, he warned. No mention of education. Describe him only as a well-trained domestic. French-speaking, rare. Rigault smiled. Buyers will say it for me. He lifted his hand. The crowd quieted. Bring him to the platform. Gaines guided Jean-Baptiste onto the marble block at the center of the rotunda, a circle of white stone that had held thousands of souls before him, but none like him. He stood tall. He kept his eyes forward. He refused to let his shoulders slump. If he must lose everything, he would not lose dignity. The first touch to demonstrate a slave, the auctioneer usually placed a hand under the chin, tilting the head, showing the jawline, the teeth, the posture. Rigault reached for Jean-Baptiste's chin. Jean flinched, barely, but enough. The room reacted as if he had cried out. He's proud, someone whispered. He'll break. No, he's just unused to handling. 6,000 at least. He's too fine for plantation work. A house servant for a governor. A companion for a widow. A French tutor. Perhaps. Each suggestion cut deeper than the last. Rigault turned to the crowd and lifted his voice. Gentlemen and ladies, what you see before you is a rarity of the highest order. A young male, 23, of exceptional appearance and refined manner, speaks French fluently, trained in reading and writing, suitable for domestic service of every kind. Sound in body, completely docile? Docile. The word burned. Then Rigault announced, the bidding will begin at $2,000. The crowd inhaled. 2,000. The price of a skilled artisan. Someone called. 2,500. Another shouted. 3,000. The air tightened. 3,500? 4,000? The numbers struck him like blows. $4,000. More money than his father had ever held in his life, and the bids kept rising. The red line at 5,000, a woman in a violet gown stepped forward. Her voice was cool, controlled, confident. 5,500. She was perhaps 30. Beautiful. Elegant, her eyes never left Jen's face. Rigault's smile widened. 500. A planter countered. 5,008. Another man, an American, loud, sweating, shouted. 6,000. A ripple went through the rotunda. John Baptist felt the floor tilt beneath him. $6,000. More than most plantations made in a season. More than any slave of his appearance had ever sold for in recorded Louisiana history. Rigault raised both hands. 6,000 is bid! Do I hear? 7. The voice was soft but cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned. At the edge of the rotunda stood a tall, silver-haired man in a dark coat. His expression was unreadable. His eyes were fixed on Jean Baptiste with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Rigault blinked. $7,000 bid by Monsieur Barrow. Even Anatole turned sharply. He had not expected that. Monsieur Barrow was not a plantation owner. He was not a merchant. He was a politician, and a dangerous one, wealthy, ambitious, and known for acquiring people the way others acquired secrets. Silence gripped the room. No one counted. 7,000 was too high, too shocking, too ominous. Rigault lifted the gavel. Going once? Jean Baptiste's heartbeat roared in his ears. Going twice. He felt the world narrowing. Sold! To Monsieur Barrow for 7 thos. Estiope. The voice came from the entrance. Sharp, female, breathless from running. Every eye shifted to the doorway. Standing there, cloak half fallen from her shoulders, face pale with fury and fear, was Madame Laurier, the merchant's wife who had first admired him. Her finger trembled as she pointed at Anatole. That young man is no to slave, she said. Devoe is hiding something. I know him. I know his family. That boy is. The room froze. Rigault's gavel hovered in the air. Anatole's face drained of color. Jean Baptiste's breath caught in his throat. Because this moment, was the one thing his uncle had not calculated. The moment when the truth, buried under ink and lies, tried to claw its way to the surface, and the rotunda, the grand, echoing palace of commerce, had just become a courtroom. A moment that would decide whether Jean Baptiste was a man or a record, breaking sale. For a long, breathless moment, the entire rotunda seemed carved from stone. Madame Laurier stood at the entrance, chest rising and falling, cheeks flushed with the humiliation of having been ignored until now. She had not come as a bidder. She had come as a witness. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade drawn across silk. That young man is not a slave. Devoe is hiding something. The crowd reacted in a slow, rippling wave, first confusion, then interest, and finally a simmering, dangerous excitement. Nothing electrified a New Orleans auction like scandal. Rigault, the auctioneer, lowered his gavel halfway. Anatole stepped forward, controlled but rigid, his voice tight. Madame, you are mistaken. I acquired him legally. She laughed sharply, a brittle, disbelieving sound. Spare me the lies, Anatole. Your brother was in Paris for years. We all know it. And that boy, she pointed at Jean Baptiste, her hand trembling with rage, has your brother's face. A collective murmur swept through the crowd. Jean Baptiste felt the floor tilt under him. His throat tightened. This was the first time anyone in Louisiana had spoken the truth aloud. Anatole's eyes flashed a threat so sharp it could have cut glass. Madame Laurier, he said, voice low, you will control yourself. You are speaking nonsense. But she didn't stop. In fact, she stepped deeper into the rotunda, skirts whispering against the marble. She faced the bidders, the spectators, the curious ladies fanning themselves, the gentlemen leaning forward with predatory interest. You all see it, she insisted. Look at his face. Look at his posture, his manner, his speech. He's educated, trained like a gentleman, not raised like a slave. A man near the front called out, he speaks French better than the auctioneer. Another voice added, he looks like white Creole, not mixed. What plantation births a man like that? Yet another, there's fraud here. Fraud. The word made Rigault, the auctioneer, stiffen visibly. Fraud meant liability. Liability meant ruined reputations and lawsuits. This was dangerous territory. Anatole plays his hand. Anatole stepped forward, posture crisp, his voice icy but authoritative. "This woman," he said, "is attempting to sabotage a lawful sale. My nephew, my actual nephew, died years ago. This boy has a resemblance, yes, but that is common among mixed breeds." Gasps. A few men nodded. A few women pressed gloved hands to their mouths. Jean-Baptiste felt the words like a whip across his back. Mixed breed. A label meant to erase identity, heritage, truth. Madame Laurier trembled with fury. "You think because I am a woman, I will stay silent? I knew your brother Anatole. I danced beside him at the St. Charles ball." Anatole snapped, "Enough." But the rotunda was already shifting. Power tilting, cracks opening. Rigault raised both hands, trying to restore control. "Madame Laurier, unless you have documentation, we cannot." She cut him off. "Documentation? Ask him." Her finger stabbed the air at Jean-Baptiste. "If he is a slave, let him speak. If he is a free man, you cannot stop him." A wary rustle swept the bidders. Slaves did not speak at auctions. Slaves did not make claims. Slaves did not challenge owners. If Jean-Baptiste opened his mouth, he would cross a forbidden line. He felt every eye on him: curiosity, desire, suspicion, cruelty. He also felt something else rising inside him, the truth, burning like a brand. He knew the moment he spoke, everything would change. For better, for worse, forever. Anatole saw the shift in his posture and hissed, "Jean." Not a word. Jean-Baptiste raised his head. He had spent weeks bowing, bending, agreeing. Not here. Not while the truth begged to breathe. Rigault tried again. "Boy, do not." But he was already speaking. The forbidden words his voice carried across the rotunda, clear and steady, dripping with the accent of Paris that no plantation in Louisiana could ever produce. "Je suis né libre." A ripple of shock surged through the crowd. Precise, articulate, undeniable. "I was born free, in Paris. I am Jean-Baptiste de Vierux, son of Christophe de Vierux and Celeste Marat. My baptism is recorded, my education." Anatole lunged. "Silence!" Too late. The room erupted. What did he say? He has a birth record. Did he say Paris? He claims to be free. Impossible. Or is it? Rigault froze, face pale. If a single word of this was true, continuing the sale would destroy him. "Boy," he said, voice wavering, "you must not say such." Jean-Baptiste raised his chin. "I have documentation, seized by the man who now pretends to own me. Ask him why he hides my papers." It was a direct accusation. A bright flame in a room filled with powder. Madame Laurier gasped. Rigault went rigid. The bidders leaned forward, hungry for scandal. Anatole stepped onto the platform and struck Jean-Baptiste hard across the face. The slap echoed under the dome like a pistol shot. Women cried out. Men rose from their seats. Someone shouted, "If he is free, that's assault." Someone else yelled, "He's lying to avoid sale." Rigault shouted, "Stop!" But the rotunda was already boiling over. A new threat enters the room. At the back of the crowd, a doorway opened quietly. A man stepped through, tall, lean, wearing the blue sash of municipal authority. His presence alone suffocated the noise. The crowd parted like water. It was Captain Augustin Mercier, officer of the New Orleans City Guard and liaison to the French consulate. His gaze locked onto Jean-Baptiste, then onto Anatole, then onto Rigault. In a voice cold enough to silence the last whispers, he said, "This auction will halt immediately." Anatole stiffened. "By what authority?" Mercier lifted a folded document sealed in red wax. "By the authority of the French consulate," he said. "We received a letter this morning from a French citizen claiming wrongful enslavement." An electric hush swept the room. Jean-Baptiste's heart slammed against his ribs. He knew exactly which letter it was. The one he had written in his cabin. The one he entrusted to Thomas. The one he prayed, desperately, would reach the consulate. It reached. Mercier continued, "A letter signed by Jean-Baptiste de Vierux." He turned his gaze fully on the young man on the platform. "Is that you?" And now every eye in the rotunda, Every curious, greedy, suspicious, horrified eye waited for the answer. The air felt thin. The marble under his feet felt cold. His pulse hammered like a drum. If he lied, he would lose everything. If he told the truth, he might die for it. He inhaled once and steadied himself. And cess! The rotunda exploded into chaos. The rotunda did not simply erupt. It fractured. Voices clashed like steel on steel, wealthy men shouting over each other, women clutching pearls, Rigaud pounding his gavel in a futile attempt at control. But none of the noise mattered, because Captain Augustin Mercier had spoken the one sentence that could shatter the entire auction. We received a letter from a French citizen claiming wrongful enslavement. Every head turned toward Jean-Baptiste. Anatole's face drained of blood, then flushed deep crimson, rage pulsing under his skin like a hidden heartbeat. Jean-Baptiste forced himself to stand straighter, though his knees trembled. He felt the weight of the moment press against his ribs. Mercier stepped closer, his boots echoing sharply on the marble floor. "Repeat it," Mercier instructed. "State your name for the record." Jean-Baptiste swallowed hard. "I am Jean-Baptiste de Viroux," he said. "Born free in Paris, son of Christophe de Viroux and Céleste Marot, French citizens." The words rang out like a declaration in a courtroom. Some men scoffed. Others murmured in disbelief. But many, far more than before, noticed the polished Parisian accent, the posture, the schooling in every gesture, every breath he took. A man who had grown in freedom could always be spotted by those trained to look. Mercier nodded once, slowly. "Then your letter is genuine." Jean-Baptiste exhaled shakily. For the first time in weeks, anyone, believed him. But Anatole stepped forward, voice sharp enough to cut through stone. "This is a fabrication! He is the son of my slave, Céleste!" He is delusional, believing stories his mother whispered to him as a child. Jean-Baptiste felt the sting of that lie pierce straight through the ribs. Céleste Marot had been elegant, educated, proud, and Anatole had twisted her memory into something convenient and disposable. Mercier's eyes narrowed. "You claim this youth was born enslaved?" "Yes," Anatole snapped. "It is recorded. My plantation books list her as my property." Jean-Baptiste spoke through clenched teeth. "That record was written after my arrival." Gasps rippled through the gallery of observers. Mercier lifted a sealed envelope. "This letter describes in detail how your papers were confiscated upon arrival at the plantation. It matches the dates your brother's ship logs confirm. It also contains references to French legal terms that no uneducated person could imitate." Anatole opened his mouth, but no words came out, because he knew the truth. He knew exactly what Jean-Baptiste knew. He knew what that letter must contain, a record of every crime he hoped to bury. Rigaud, the auctioneer, interjected nervously. "This is becoming a legal matter. I cannot proceed." "You will not proceed," Mercier said sharply. He turned toward the two city constables at his side. "Remove the young man from the platform. He is no longer under the authority of this auction house." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. "What does this mean? Is he free? Will the sale be cancelled? Has a fraud been exposed?" The constables approached Jean-Baptiste, not with chains, not with ropes, but with cautious respect, the way one approached someone whose true status remained dangerously uncertain. But when they reached the platform, Anatole lunged between them and his nephew. "You will not take him." One constable stepped back, startled. Mercier did not flinch. "And why not, Monsieur de Viroux?" "Because he is my—" Anatole roared. The rotunda fell silent. The words hung in the air like the smoke before a gunshot. Jean-Baptiste felt something inside him go still. Not fear, something colder, something darker, something like resolve. Mercier's gaze hardened. "Your claim is under investigation. Until it is settled, he is not your property." Anatole's breath shook with fury. "He will run. He will disappear." "He will shame my name," Mercier replied softly, but with lethal authority. "Then perhaps he should not have been brought here in chains of your making." A collective gasp rose. It was the closest anyone in Louisiana had come to calling Anatole a criminal, to his face, in public. Anatole's hand slid toward his coat, where he often kept a hidden blade. The constables noticed instantly. Jean-Baptiste's breath caught. A single wrong move, and the rotunda would drown in blood. Mercier lifted his chin, eyes sharp as flint. "Do you intend to draw steel in front of the city guard, monsieur?" Anatole froze. His fingers twitched. His jaw tightened. Then slowly, painfully slowly, he lowered his hand. Mercier stepped past him and stood before Jean-Baptiste. "You are coming with us?" he said quietly. Jean-Baptiste nodded, not because he trusted Mercier fully, but because he had no other path left. The constables escorted him down the marble steps. Women leaned forward, breathless. Men whispered heatedly. No one looked away. Jean-Baptiste, for the first time, saw what he truly was in their eyes: not a commodity, not a servant, not an object, but a scandal, a revelation, a threat to everything they believed was fixed and unquestionable. As they reached the door, Jean-Baptiste turned once, just once, and met Anatole's eyes. His uncle stared back at him, trembling with silent fury, but beneath it something deeper: fear. Fear of truth, fear of exposure, fear of the nephew he had tried to erase. Jean-Baptiste held his gaze and whispered a single sentence meant only for him: "You will not bury me." And then he stepped out into the sunlight, leaving the rotunda behind, leaving the chains behind, leaving the lie behind. But freedom, as he would soon discover, had its own price. And the city of New Orleans was not finished with him yet. The sun outside the St. Louis hotel was blinding. Jean-Baptiste blinked hard as he stepped into the courtyard, the noise of the auction fading behind him like a nightmare retreating into shadow. People had followed them, not physically, but with their eyes. Through windows, through balcony railings, through whispers that scattered like startled birds across the square. Everyone in New Orleans would know his name by sunset. He wasn't sure if that was salvation or a death sentence. Taken to the cabildo, the constables did not drag him. They walked beside him, one on the left, one on the right. Captain Mercier slightly ahead, chin lifted, coat crisp, stride measured. The cabildo, the city's government building, loomed across Jackson Square like a stern guardian of secrets. The very ground felt different as they crossed it, shifting from the commerce of the hotel district to the cold authority of the law. Inside, the air smelled of ink, dust, and old judgments. They brought him to a narrow room, not a cell, not a guest chamber, something in between. A cot, a table, a barred window, a place made for men whose status could not be named. Mercier turned, arms folded behind him. "You will remain here until the investigation concludes." Jean-Baptiste nodded slightly. He forced his voice steady. "Am I under arrest?" Mercier considered the question. "No," he said at last, "but neither can you be released." Unresolved. Unresolved. The word stung more than slave ever did. "Then what am I?" Jean-Baptiste whispered. "You are evidence." Jean-Baptiste went still. "Evidence, not a person." "Not yet," Mercier added more quietly. "You wrote a strong letter, precise, educated, that saved your life today. Do not underestimate that." He placed a tin cup of water on the table. "You will have food. You will be questioned. But no harm will come to you here. That is my word." Then he left. The key turned in the lock. Silence settled thickly around Jean-Baptiste, but his pulse refused to calm. He was alive. He was out of Anatole's hands. But he was trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. The interrogations begin hours later. Perhaps only one, perhaps 10. Officials arrived. A judge, 2 clerks, a representative from the French consulate, a lawyer whose eyes were cold and calculating, like he was measuring Jean-Baptiste's bones. They questioned him about everything: his birth, his parents, his education, the date he arrived in Louisiana, his father's letters, the condition of the ship, the shape of the Parisian church where he was baptized. He answered calmly at first, but as the questions repeated, twisted, looped back, he understood something horrifying. They were not looking for truth. They were searching for a flaw. A single misstep, a waver in his memory, a stumble in his story. Anything that could justify what Anatole had done. Because if Jean-Baptiste was proven free, Then the auction house was liable. The plantation was liable. The city of New Orleans was liable. And powerful men did not surrender easily. The judge finally said, "You claim French birth, but can anyone in Louisiana verify your mother's free status at the time of your birth?" "I have documents," Jean Baptiste replied. "Documents in the possession of a man who denies your story," the judge said softly. The words felt like knives. The French representative intervened. "His baptismal certificate is legitimate. His birth registry is legitimate. France recognizes him as a free citizen." The judge frowned. The French official stiffened. "This young man is both." The judge sighed heavily. Paperwork shuffled. The interrogations were not meant to expose truth. They were meant to buy time, to let the city feel the mood of the elite, to see whose interests outweighed whose. By nightfall, Jean Baptiste was exhausted. He sat on the cot, arms wrapped around himself, shivering in the humid air. He had told the truth, every word, but truth did not walk freely here. It limped. The political earthquake behind closed doors, outside the locked room. New Orleans was on fire with gossip. The wealthiest households whispered the tale. Many were outraged, not at injustice, but at embarrassment. To sell a free man? At the St. Louis Hotel, the French will be insufferable. Devireux has disgraced us. Some demanded Jean Baptiste be freed immediately. Others insisted he be punished for disrupting an auction. The city guard was caught in the middle. So were the judges. So was the French consulate, and the one man who feared the truth more than all of them, Anatole Devireux. He stayed in New Orleans after the auction. He visited lawyers. He bribed officials. He pressured witnesses. He sent word back to the plantation with instructions that no one, absolutely no one, was to speak of Jean Baptiste's arrival. He tried to manufacture a past for a man who refused to disappear. By the morning of the third day, he had woven a narrative carefully crafted to erase everything. Jean Baptiste was the illegitimate son of a slave named Celeste. He had been brought to Paris as a child. He had been pampered beyond his station. He had returned to Louisiana bearing delusions of grandeur. Anatole told this lie so calmly, so confidently, that some men believed it on the spot. Others only pretended to, because no one wanted to admit that a beautiful young man, educated, white, passing, multilingual, could be taken off a boat and turned into property simply because a wealthy uncle willed it so. That truth was too inconvenient, too dangerous, too humiliating. Jean Baptiste makes a silent decision by the third night in the Cabildo. Jean Baptiste understood something clearly. Even if he won, he would lose. Even if he proved he was free, Louisiana would always see him as almost something, but not quite. A shadow in the law. A complication. A man whose existence threatened the delicate lies the city survived on. He sat at the table, staring at the letter he had written, the one that saved him. Then he reached for a quill and began writing again. Not to the French consulate, not to the city authorities, not even to the judge, but to someone else entirely, someone he had not dared reach out to before, someone whose intervention could either save him or bury him forever. He folded the letter, pressed the seal, and hid it in the lining of his coat. He would deliver it if fate allowed. The whisper that changed everything. Late that night, as he lay awake, he heard footsteps stop outside his door. A key turned halfway. Not fully, just enough. A voice whispered through the crack. A familiar voice. "Jean Jean Baptiste?" It breathed. "Someone is coming for you?" He froze. "Who?" he whispered. The voice trembled. Not the city guard, not the French, someone else. The key slipped out. Footsteps retreated. Jean Baptiste sat upright, pulse hammering. Outside, somewhere in the spinning darkness of New Orleans, a new threat had awakened. Not legal, not political, personal. Someone did not intend for him to see another dawn. Someone who wanted the problem solved quietly, permanently, and everything inside him knew. That someone was connected to Anatole. The Cabildo was never silent. Old buildings breathe, shift, mutter in wood and stone. But after midnight on the fourth night, the silence around Jean Baptiste felt wrong, too complete, too still. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Someone was coming for him. Not to question him, not to escort him, not to erase him. A free man declared enslaved, an enslaved man claiming to be free. Both were dangerous, but a man who had nearly exposed the lies of Louisiana's elite in a crowded auction hall. Unforgivable. The footsteps that didn't belong near 2 o'clock. Soft steps approached his door. Not the rhythm of a guard, not the heavy march of officials. Careful steps, predatory steps, his breath thinned. A shadow blocked the gap under the door. Then, the faint scrape of metal, not a key, a tool. Someone was trying to pick the lock. John Baptist's heart slammed in his chest. If they entered, there would be no witnesses, no records, no investigation. Just a body found in the morning with a convenient explanation. Attempted escape, resisted arrest. Unstable slave took his own life. Louisiana had many ways to bury truth. He slipped silently off the cot, positioning himself behind the door, mind racing. He had no weapon, no strength against multiple men. But he had the only advantage: they didn't expect: preparation. The lock clicked. The door began to open. Jean Baptiste used the weight of his body to slam it back with sudden, explosive force. A grunt, a curse. A man staggered backward into the dim hall. Jean Baptiste bolted past him. He did not look at the man. He did not want to give the threat a face. His feet pounded the wooden hallway. Guards shouted. Doors banged open. He sprinted down a staircase he had memorized during the daylight interrogations. 2 flights, then a turn, then the exit used by clerks. He didn't have freedom yet, but he had air. He burst into the courtyard. The humid night hit him like a furnace. The city slept restlessly, shutters half closed, lamps flickering in warm pools of trembling light. Behind him, boots thundered on stone. "Stop him! Escape the holding room! Close the gates!" He had seconds, no more. The stranger in the alley, he darted into the narrow alley beside the cabildo. Moonlight carved thin, silver lines along the walls. He clutched his coat, feeling the letter inside, the one he had written as a last resort. He turned sharply and collided with someone. A figure stepped from the shadows. A woman, veiled, tall, elegant, black dress blending into the darkness. Her voice was low, steady, unmistakably Creole. Jean Baptiste de Virax. His breath caught. "Wes!" She pressed something into his hand. A key, a small map of the French Quarter, and a folded piece of parchment with a seal he recognized instantly. "The French consulate," she whispered. "He said you would need this if you lived." "Ooh," Jean Baptiste asked. But she was already gone, swallowed by the alley, dissolving like smoke. Behind him, the guards were closing in. He had no time to question the miracle. He ran. Through the labyrinth of New Orleans he moved, through the quarter, like a hunted animal, not knowing which doors were safe, which eyes watched from shutters, which footsteps were friend or foe. Every sound felt amplified: the rattle of carriage wheels, the distant music of a tavern, the murmur of a drunk on a stoop, a dog barking in the distance. The map led him toward the river. Behind him, cries echoed. "He went that way? Stop that man! City guard! Make way!" But there were also other sounds, softer, whispered from alley windows. "Goo! Run! Don't stop!" Were they voices of freedmen, house servants, or simply people who despised the plantation class? He didn't know. He only knew he was not running entirely alone. At the river's edge he reached the levee, breathless, chest heaving. The Mississippi lay before him, dark, vast, restless. A small boat was tied to the dock, and sitting inside, oars in hand, waiting as if this moment had been preordained, was Thomas, the stable hand from Rivière-aux-Chenilles, the man he had trusted with his letter, the man he never expected to see again. Thomas whispered urgently, "Get in, before they come." Jean Baptiste hesitated, only a heartbeat. Then he climbed in. Thomas pushed off, muscles tightening as he rode them into the current. Shouts echoed from the levee. "There, on the water! Shoot if you must! De Virax wants him alive!" Gunshots cracked through the night. Bullets ripped into the river around them. Jean Baptiste ducked. Thomas kept rowing, fearless, teeth clenched against the pane of splintered wood and splashing lead. The current took them. The city grew smaller, The shouts faded behind them, and for the first time since arriving in Louisiana, the chains, invisible, silent, suffocating, loosened. The final goodbye, when the river carried them far enough, Thomas stopped rowing. He was shaking, from exhaustion or adrenaline. Jean-Baptiste couldn't tell. "Why did you risk everything?" Jean-Baptiste whispered. Thomas stared at the water. "Because you wrote the truth, and someone in this world needed to read it." He handed Jean-Baptiste a small cloth pouch. Inside were coins, enough for travel, a folded note, and his mother's rosary. Jean-Baptiste felt tears sting his eyes. "What about you?" he asked. Thomas smiled sadly. "People like me don't get chased. We vanish on our own." Jean-Baptiste understood. He reached for Thomas's hand and clasped it tight. "Thank you," he said. "Live." Thomas replied, "That's thanks enough." With that, he angled the boat toward the opposite shore, the side that led not to New Orleans, but to roads north, to freedom, to possibility, to a new name, a new life, a new beginning. And so he vanished by sunrise. Jean-Baptiste de Virax had disappeared. Some said he boarded a ship in secret. Some said he walked north through the swamps until he reached safer states. Others whispered he crossed into Canada, where no slave laws could touch him. No record ever confirmed his fate. But some decades later, in Montreal, a school ledger listed Jean B. Divroux, instructor of French, handwriting, and mathematics. Born 1829, no birthplace listed, no parents named, no history before arrival. Just a note penned by the headmaster, an exceptionally refined man, haunted eyes, a gentle soul, the impossible slave, the man who declared himself free on the marble block, the man no one could break or bury. He did not survive by accident. He survived because he refused to disappear.